The morning sun spills through tall arched windows, casting golden stripes across polished oak floors. Outside, beyond the manicured lawns of Crestview Academy, the harbor glitters like glass. Massive gray naval ships move slowly in the distance, silent, powerful, almost mythic. Inside room 204, 12-year-old Amara Thompson sits at her desk with her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looks small. She looks ordinary. She looks like a child who has just been dismissed. But what no one in this room understands is that power doesn't always arrive with flashing lights. Sometimes it sits quietly in the third row. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your city in the comments. And if you believe dignity should never be questioned based on appearance, take a moment to subscribe, because stories like this matter. Now let's go back to the moment it all started. The school sat on a hill like a monument to success. Crestview Academy was the kind of institution where legacy families had plaques in hallways, where portraits of former valedictorians hung beside framed newspaper articles about Ivy League acceptances, where reputation was currency. Every morning, luxury vehicles curved up the long stone driveway, sleek black sedans, European SUVs, the occasional chauffeur-driven town car. Parents stepped out wearing tailored suits, silk scarves, polished shoes that never touched dirt. And then there was Amara. Her father dropped her off in a simple, dark blue sedan. No driver. No escort. No fuss. He always parked at the far edge of the circle to avoid blocking traffic. He would turn slightly in his seat and offer the same warm smile. "Lead with integrity," he'd say. "Always," Amara would reply. She never mentioned that sometimes when she hugged him goodbye, she could smell salt water and metal, the faint scent of ships and sea air that clung to naval uniforms. She never mentioned the medals carefully stored in a locked cabinet at home. She never mentioned the early mornings when uniformed officers stood respectfully at their gate. Her father had been clear. "Service is not spectacle," Admiral David Thompson would tell her. "We don't need applause to do what's right." So she carried that with her. Quietly, Mrs. Eleanor Hawthorne believed she understood children. 22 years at Crestview, countless academic awards, a reputation for molding young minds into disciplined scholars. She wore crisp blouses and structured skirts. Her gray-streaked hair was always pulled into a low bun. She moved with precision, like someone who measured life in straight lines and proper grammar. She valued order. She valued honesty. And above all, she valued status. It wasn't that she said it out loud. It was subtler than that. The way her smile widened for certain last names. The way her tone softened when speaking to children of donors. The way it hardened for those who didn't quite fit. Amara had noticed. She noticed everything. Career day arrived on a Monday. A bright banner stretched across the whiteboard. "Future leaders start here." Students buzzed with excitement, shuffling note cards and adjusting poster boards. Some had props, mini stethoscopes, toy gavels, laminated photos of office buildings. Mrs. Hawthorne clapped her hands. "Remember," she said, voice measured, "honesty is the foundation of character. We speak truth here." The words lingered. One by one, students stood. "My mom is a corporate attorney. My dad owns a chain of restaurants. My parents invest in tech startups." Applause followed each declaration. Amara listened. She didn't compare. She didn't compete. When her name was called, she rose slowly, smoothed the front of her navy blazer. "My dad works for the Navy," she said calmly. "He's the Chief of Naval Staff." For half a second, silence. Then laughter. A ripple. Not loud but sharp. Like paper tearing. Mrs. Hawthorne adjusted her glasses. Her smile tightened. "Let's be honest, Amara," she said lightly. It's important we tell the truth. What does your father actually do? The class stilled. Amara blinked once. That is what he does, ma'am. A faint chuckle from the back. The Chief of Naval Staff, Mrs. Hawthorne repeated, tone cooling, is one of the highest-ranking officers in the country. That's not something we pretend about. Pretend. The word hung heavy. Amara felt heat crawl up her neck. But she didn't cry, didn't protest, didn't shrink. She simply said, I'm not pretending. Mrs. Hawthorne exhaled sharply. We value integrity at Crestview. Please sit down. And that was that. The class moved on. But something had shifted. Across the harbor that same morning, a naval briefing concluded aboard a massive gray vessel. Officers stood as Admiral David Thompson entered the room, tall, composed, uniform immaculate. He spoke quietly, authority and restraint. When the meeting ended, an aide approached him with a tablet. Sir, your presence is requested at a school function this week, Crestview Academy. He nodded once. Understood. He didn't know why yet. But he would. Back in room 204, whispers began to circulate. She's lying. Why would she say that? Maybe her dad works on a boat or something. Amara kept her gaze forward. She wrote in her notebook. Her handwriting remained steady. Inside, though, questions echoed. Why didn't she believe me? Would she have said that to someone else? She thought of her father's words. Integrity doesn't need volume. That afternoon, she walked to the pickup lane alone. The dark blue sedan pulled up. Her father smiled as always. Good day. She paused. Yes, sir. He studied her for a moment, longer than usual. But she didn't elaborate. And he didn't press. Because dignity sometimes means choosing silence. That evening, Mrs. Hawthorne recounted the story at dinner. These children, she sighed to her husband, they fabricate the most outrageous things. She chuckled. It's almost sad. She never considered she might be wrong. She never imagined that somewhere across the city, the very man she dismissed was reviewing national security briefings. False confidence is quiet at first. Then it grows roots. The next day, Crestview Academy buzzed with subtle tension. 2 faculty members whispered near the office. A call had come in. Verification requested. Credentials confirmed. The name Thompson had triggered something in the administrative system. Mrs. Hawthorne remained unaware. She entered her classroom Wednesday morning as always. Pearls adjusted. Attendance sheet ready. Composure intact. Amara sat at her desk. Calm. Steady. Unmoved. Because truth doesn't panic. It waits. Outside, beyond the tall windows, something unusual stirred at the front gate. Security radios crackled. Faculty members peered through blinds. And in the distance, at the base of the hill, black SUVs turned into the driveway. Engines humming. Windows tinted. Moving with quiet, deliberate precision. Inside room 204, Mrs. Hawthorne began writing the day's objective on the board. She didn't notice the subtle vibration in the hallway. Didn't notice the assistant principal rushing past. Didn't notice the way Amara lifted her eyes, not in fear, but in recognition. Power, after all, doesn't shout. It arrives. The engines outside did not roar. They purred. That was the unsettling part. From the third-floor window of Crestview Academy, the black SUVs looked like shadows gliding across sunlight. Faculty members paused mid-conversation. A receptionist straightened her blazer. Security guards spoke in hushed tones into their radios. Inside room 204, Mrs. Hawthorne remained unaware. Chalk dust clung to her fingertips as she wrote in firm cursive across the board. Character is defined by honesty. Amara noticed the irony. She lowered her eyes to her notebook and continued outlining her math assignment, movements careful and unhurried. Around her, whispers thickened. Why are there security cars? Is someone famous coming? Maybe a senator's kid. A boy leaned back in his chair and glanced at Amara. Hey, he muttered under his breath, maybe it's your Navy dad. Soft laughter followed. Amara didn't respond. She had learned early that reacting feeds the fire. Silence starves it. Mrs. Hawthorne turned. Focus, please. Her tone was clipped, slightly sharper than usual. Something in the air felt off to her too, though she couldn't name it. A ripple beneath the surface of her carefully ordered morning. She adjusted her pearls again. Order, control, structure. Those were her anchors. By lunch, the story had traveled. Students from other classes approached Amara in the hallway. Did you really say your dad runs the Navy? You know that's impossible, right? My mom says only career, military families get that high. Each comment was dressed as curiosity. But underneath was disbelief. Amara walked between lockers painted navy blue, her reflection fractured in metal doors. Why is it impossible, she wondered. Because of how I look. Because we don't drive a Bentley. Because my dad doesn't introduce himself by rank. She swallowed the ache forming in her chest. Her father had warned her gently about this world. Sometimes people confuse humility with weakness, he once told her while polishing his dress shoes. Let them. Across campus, in the administrative wing, the principal, Dr. Langford, held a phone to his ear. Yes, sir, we understand the sensitivity, of course. We value integrity deeply here. His knuckles whitened slightly. When he hung up, he exhaled slowly. There's been a misunderstanding, he told the assistant principal. A pause. We need to handle this carefully. Back in the classroom after lunch, Mrs. Hawthorne decided to address it. Her heels clicked against the hardwood as she stood before the class. I'd like to revisit something from Monday, she began, hands clasped neatly in front of her. It has come to my attention that certain claims may require clarification. Amara felt 30 pairs of eyes turned toward her. The air thickened. I believe, Mrs. Hawthorne continued, that exaggeration can sometimes feel tempting, especially when surrounded by high-achieving families. But here at Crestview, we uphold standards. A boy coughed to hide a laugh. A girl smirked. Amara lifted her chin. I didn't exaggerate, she said quietly. The room froze. Mrs. Hawthorne's jaw tightened. Amara, she replied, voice lowering, we can discuss this privately. No, ma'am, Amara answered, not defiant, not loud, just steady. I told the truth. There it was. A line drawn. And Mrs. Hawthorne crossed it. Enough, she snapped. We will not continue this disruption. False statements about national leadership are serious matters. I suggest you reconsider your story. False statements. Serious matters. The words were heavy, deliberate. Humiliation wrapped in professionalism. Several students exchanged glances. No one spoke. Silent witnesses. Eyes down. Hands folded. No one intervened. Amara felt something new then. Not anger. Not fear. Something steadier. Resolve. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. You do not raise your voice to be heard. You raise your standards. She stood again, heart beating evenly. My father's name is Admiral David Thompson, she said clearly. He is the Chief of Naval Staff. I'm proud of him. Gasps. Actual gasps. Mrs. Hawthorne's lips pressed thin. "That will be enough," she said, though her voice had lost some of its certainty. "Please sit down." Amara sat. Calm. Composed. The bell rang seconds later, slicing through the tension like a blade. Students poured into the hallway, buzzing louder than before. Did she just double down? She's crazy. No way she'd say a real admiral's name. But in the back of her mind, Mrs. Hawthorne felt the first flicker of unease. Admiral David Thompson. The name sounded familiar. She dismissed it. Coincidence. Children make things up. They always have. That afternoon, in the school parking lot, Amara waited alone longer than usual. The SUVs from earlier remained parked near the administrative building. Men in crisp naval uniforms stood near them, posture straight, faces unreadable. Students stared openly now. Speculation turned electric. Is it for her? Are they investigating something? Mrs. Hawthorne exited the building with controlled strides, though her eyes flickered toward the vehicles. A uniformed officer spoke quietly, with Dr. Langford near the entrance. Their expressions were serious. Measured. Mrs. Hawthorne's stomach tightened. But pride is a powerful blindfold. She walked past them chin high. Inside the sedan, Admiral Thompson watched. He did not step out yet. He did not make a scene. He observed. Because leadership studies before it acts. From his vantage point, he saw his daughter walking toward the curb. Back straight. Steps unhurried. She did not look defeated. She looked dignified. The kind of dignity that doesn't need applause. He stepped out of the vehicle at last. The officer straightened instantly. Conversations hushed. Even the wind seemed to pause. Mrs. Hawthorne turned, just slightly, curiosity drawing her gaze. She saw the uniform first. The medals. The quiet authority radiating from a man who did not rush. And then she heard someone whisper behind her. "That's him." Her pulse skipped. No. It couldn't be. The admiral didn't look toward her. He walked directly to Amara. Knelt slightly to meet her eyes. "Good afternoon," he said softly. "Good afternoon, sir," she replied. No drama. No display. Just respect. He stood. Turned. And this time, his gaze met Mrs. Hawthorne. Only for a moment. But in that moment, certainty cracked. The next morning, the tension was no longer subtle. Parents whispered in the drop-off lane. Faculty emails circulated quietly. Urgent meeting at 10 a.m. Mrs. Hawthorne arrived early, hands slightly unsteady as she poured her coffee. She told herself she had done nothing wrong. She had upheld standards. She had protected the school's integrity. But beneath the rehearsed justification, doubt crept in. What if? No. Impossible. And yet, inside the classroom, Amara opened her textbook as usual. Her classmates stared openly now. No one laughed today. No one whispered. They waited. The clock ticked louder than before. Outside, the sound of synchronized footsteps echoed in the hallway. Measured. Disciplined. Approaching. Mrs. Hawthorne looked up sharply. A knock. 3 firm raps. The door opened. A naval officer stepped in. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said respectfully, "the Admiral would like a word." Not Mr. Thompson. Not a parent. The Admiral. The room went still. And Mrs. Hawthorne's carefully constructed confidence began to crumble. Mrs. Hawthorne smoothed her blouse. Forced composure. "I'll be right back," she told the class. As she stepped into the hallway, the weight of dozens of unseen eyes followed her. Amara remained seated. hands folded, breathing steady, because the truth does not chase validation. It waits for it to arrive. And just beyond the hallway corner, Admiral David Thompson stood waiting. The hallway outside room 204 had never felt so narrow. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Trophy cases lined the walls, filled with plaques and polished silver cups that reflected distorted images of everyone who passed by. Students pressed subtly against classroom doors, pretending to adjust backpacks or tie shoes, straining to see. At the end of the corridor stood Admiral David Thompson. Tall, composed, his Navy dress uniform was immaculate, midnight blue with rows of ribbons and medals that caught the light in quiet flashes. Gold braiding framed his shoulders. His cap rested under one arm. He wasn't flanked by noise. He was flanked by presence. Two uniformed officers stood a respectful distance behind him, posture rigid, eyes forward. Mrs. Hawthorne slowed as she approached. For the first time in 22 years at Crestview Academy, she felt uncertain on her own ground. "Admiral," she began, voice carefully measured, "welcome to Crestview." He inclined his head politely. "Mrs. Hawthorne." Her name and his voice sounded different, not accusatory, not warm, simply precise. "I understand," he continued evenly. "There has been some confusion regarding my daughter's honesty." The words were soft, but they landed heavy. Mrs. Hawthorne swallowed. There was a misunderstanding during a classroom presentation. Children sometimes tell the truth," he interrupted gently. "Not sharp, not loud. Just firm." Silence expanded between them. From inside the classroom, 30 students held their breath. The door remained slightly ajar, enough to hear, enough to witness. Dr. Langford hurried down the hall, face flushed. "Admiral Thompson," he said quickly, extending his hand, "we deeply regret." The Admiral shook it once. Measured. "Regret is a beginning," he replied. "Understanding is better." Mrs. Hawthorne felt heat crawl up her neck. She tried to steady her voice. "If your daughter felt dismissed, that was not my intention. However, the position she claimed is mine," he said calmly. And in that moment, the hallway shifted. Not physically, energetically. It was as if gravity had tilted. A group of parents at the stairwell gasped softly. A student dropped a binder. Mrs. Hawthorne blinked. Her lips parted, but no words came. The Admiral reached into his inner pocket and removed an official identification folder. He handed it to Dr. Langford, not dramatically, just factually. Seal, signature, authority, verification. No theatrics, just truth. Inside the classroom, Amara sat perfectly still. She could hear every word, each syllable. Her classmates' eyes darted between her and the doorway. The same students who had laughed now stared, as if seeing her for the first time. But she did not smirk, did not gloat. She simply breathed. Because dignity does not celebrate vindication. It absorbs it. Mrs. Hawthorne felt the floor beneath her suddenly fragile. Her certainty dissolved. I see," she managed. The Admiral studied her, not with anger, but with expectation. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, voice steady as the sea before a storm, "my daughter was raised to tell the truth. I trust the educators at Crestview value the same." The statement was neither threat nor accusation. It was mirror, and she could not look away. Of course we do," she said quickly. "This was simply a misunderstanding." Amara stepped into the hallway then. No one had told her to. She just walked forward. Calm. Small shoes against polished floor. Her father glanced down at her. Pride flickered in his eyes. not because she had been proven right, but because she had never wavered. Mrs. Hawthorne looked at the girl she had publicly corrected, the girl she had told to be honest, and realization dawned, not just about the title, but about the assumption. She hadn't doubted the job because it was unlikely. She had doubted it because it came from Amara, because power in her mind had a particular look, and it did not look like this 12-year-old black girl in a neatly pressed uniform. Stop, did you see that coming? That look, that's realization colliding with regret. What do you think is going through Mrs. Hawthorne's mind right now? Let us know below. Dr. Langford cleared his throat nervously. We would like to invite you to the boardroom, Admiral. We want to resolve this appropriately. The Admiral nodded. Of course. He turned to Amara. Would you like to join us? Her eyes met his. Yes, sir. They walked together down the hallway. Students parted instinctively, creating a path. Not because they were told to, but because authority, when authentic, commands space without asking. Mrs. Hawthorne remained frozen for a beat too long before following. Each step felt heavier than the last. The sound of her heels, no longer confident, now uncertain. The boardroom overlooked the harbor. Large windows framed the very ships Admiral Thompson commanded. Sunlight reflected off the water, glinting like a reminder. Power was always there. They had just failed to recognize it. Around the polished conference table sat members of Crestview's leadership, men and women who prided themselves on prestige. Today, their posture was different. Less certain, more cautious. Dr. Langford spoke first. We want to formally apologize to Amara for any embarrassment caused. Amara sat upright, hands folded in her lap. She did not interrupt. She did not rush forgiveness. Mrs. Hawthorne's voice trembled slightly when she added, Amara, I should not have questioned your honesty publicly. That was wrong. The word hung in the air. Wrong. A simple word, but rare in rooms like this. Amara looked at her. Steady. You didn't believe me, she said softly. It wasn't accusation. It was observation. Mrs. Hawthorne's shoulders sagged. I made an assumption, she admitted. The Admiral leaned forward slightly. Assumptions about children can shape the adults they become, he said. That responsibility is not small. The board members shifted uncomfortably. This was no longer about one classroom comment. This was about culture, about whose stories are believed, about which voices are validated without proof. Outside the boardroom, word spread like wildfire. Parents checked their phones. Local reporters caught wind of naval vehicles at the academy. Students whispered in awe. Her dad really is the chief. I can't believe Mrs. Hawthorne said that. Why didn't she just check? Questions multiplied. And beneath them all lay something deeper. Why was it so hard to believe her? Inside, Dr. Langford clasped his hands tightly. We are prepared to take corrective action, he said carefully. The Admiral's expression did not change. My concern, he replied, is not reputation, it is culture. He glanced at Amara. She met his gaze. Unspoken understanding passed between them. We chose this school because we believed it would nurture leadership, he continued. Leadership begins with listening. Silence again. But this silence was different. It was reflection. Mrs. Hawthorne lowered her eyes. For the first time, she saw the broader picture. How many times had she subtly favored certain students? How often had she equated polish with credibility? How deeply had bias woven itself into her standards? The Admiral rose slowly. I will allow the institution to decide how it addresses this, he said. But understand this clearly. My daughter will never be made to feel smaller for telling the truth. Not a threat. A boundary. Clear. Unshakable. As they exited the boardroom, cameras flashed faintly from beyond the gates. News had arrived. Crestview Academy was no longer insulated. The story was no longer contained. Amara walked beside her father through the corridor once more. Students stared openly now. Not with mockery, with respect. But she did not alter her stride, did not bask in attention, because she had never needed it. Mrs. Hawthorne watched from a distance. Her reflection in the trophy case glass looked distorted. For the first time she wondered, who had she really been teaching all these years? And who had she been overlooking? The nuclear revelation had detonated. Not with shouting, not with fury, but with truth. And truth, when undeniable, reshapes everything. Power had shifted. Quietly. Completely. The fallout began before the Admiral's motorcade cleared the gates. Crestview Academy had always moved with polished efficiency, emails drafted carefully, statements reviewed twice, optics managed with precision. But this was different. This wasn't a rumor. This wasn't a playground scuffle. This was credibility. And credibility, once cracked, makes a very loud sound. At 3:15 p.m., the faculty lounge filled with stiff-backed chairs and tighter expressions. Mrs. Hawthorne sat near the center of the table, hands folded so firmly her knuckles had turned pale. For the first time in decades, she wasn't leading the room. Dr. Langford stood at the front, glasses low on his nose. "We are facing a serious breach of professional judgment," he began. A student's honesty was publicly questioned without verification, and the implications extend beyond one classroom. A murmur rippled. Some teachers shifted uncomfortably. Others stared straight ahead. Because if they were honest with themselves, they'd all had moments, small dismissals, subtle assumptions, unconscious sorting of students by background. But Mrs. Hawthorne's mistake had been public. And now it was undeniable. "We will be conducting a formal review," Dr. Langford continued. "Effective immediately, Mrs. Hawthorne is placed on administrative leave pending investigation." The words landed like a gavel strike. Administrative leave. The most powerful teacher at Crestview Academy, sidelined. Mrs. Hawthorne inhaled sharply. Her identity had always been wrapped in authority, in reputation, in the belief that she knew best. Now she sat stripped of certainty. "I never intended harm," she said quietly. "No one is debating intention," Dr. Langford replied. "We are addressing impact." And impact had already begun to ripple outward. By the next morning, the story had spread beyond campus. Parents texted each other screenshots of a local news article. Naval Chief's daughter publicly accused of lying at elite academy. The headline wasn't explosive. It didn't need to be. The facts alone were enough. In the cafeteria, conversations were hushed. A boy who had laughed earlier now avoided Amara's gaze. A girl approached her tray hesitantly. "Hey, I'm sorry," she murmured. Amara looked up. Her expression remained composed. "For what?" she asked gently. "For not saying anything." That was the thing about silent witnesses. Their silence echoes later. Amara nodded once. "It's okay." But the words carried layers. Forgiveness is simple. Trust is not. Later that week, Crestview requested a private restorative meeting. Not for optics, but because Admiral Thompson had insisted on something more meaningful than punishment. "Accountability without growth is performance," he'd told Dr. Langford. "I'm not interested in performance." So in a quiet conference room, without cameras, without press, Mrs. Hawthorne sat across from Amara and her father. No pearls today. No polished authority. Just a woman confronting her reflection. "I owe you more than an apology," she began, voice fragile in a way it had never been before. "I owe you acknowledgement." She turned to Amara. "When you spoke, I didn't question the job because it was improbable. I questioned it because I had already decided what was probable for you." The room held still. Admitting bias is like admitting blindness. It requires surrender. Amara listened carefully. She noticed the tremor in Mrs. Hawthorne's hands, the slight redness in her eyes. "I don't need you to believe me because of who my father is," Amara said calmly. "I needed you to believe me because I said it." The simplicity of it pierced deeper than any accusation. Mrs. Hawthorne nodded slowly. "You're right." Admiral Thompson spoke next, voice even. "Authority is tested not by how it treats power, but by how it treats those who appear powerless. No raised volume. No anger. Just truth laid bare." Mrs. Hawthorne absorbed it like weight. "I failed that test," she whispered. The investigation moved swiftly. Anonymous surveys were sent to students. Parents were interviewed. And what surfaced wasn't explosive, but it was consistent. Students of color reported feeling scrutinized more often. First-generation scholarship students describe subtle skepticism toward their stories. Small comments, minor corrections, moments dismissed as harmless. But stacked together, they formed a pattern. A culture, not malicious, but biased. And bias, left unchecked, becomes policy. The school board reconvened. This time, not just about one teacher, but about systemic reform. At the next all-school assembly, Dr. Langford stood at the podium. The auditorium lights dimmed slightly, students filled the rows, faculty lined the walls. Amara sat in the third row. She didn't seek the stage. She didn't need it. "Crestview Academy was founded on excellence," Dr. Langford began. "But excellence without equity is incomplete." A ripple of surprise moved through the crowd. He continued, "This week we failed a student, and in doing so, we revealed areas where our culture must evolve." Mrs. Hawthorne was not present. Administrative leave had become formal review. A consulting firm specializing in equity training had been contracted. Mandatory bias workshops were announced. Transparent reporting channels for students were established. It wasn't symbolic. It was structural. The board chair stepped forward next. "We are implementing a zero-tolerance policy for dismissive conduct toward student claims without due diligence." The message was clear. Status would no longer determine credibility. After the assembly, students lingered in the hallways. There was something different in the air. Not fear. Awareness. A subtle recalibration of how they saw each other. Amara walked toward her locker. A boy stepped aside to let her pass. Not out of intimidation. Out of respect. And yet she did not change. Did not gloat. Did not retell the story. She opened her locker, retrieved her notebook, and headed to class. Because her dignity had never depended on revelation. At home, Mrs. Hawthorne sat alone at her kitchen table. The house was silent. For the first time in years, she wasn't preparing lesson plans. She wasn't grading papers. She was thinking. She replayed the moment over and over. Let's be honest, Amara. The tight smile. The dismissive tone. The assumption. She had prided herself on fairness. On meritocracy. On discipline. But fairness without introspection had blinded her. She reached for her phone. Scrolled through news coverage. Saw comments from parents. some angry, some disappointed, some reflective. Her legacy, once unshakable, now uncertain. But somewhere beneath the humiliation, growth flickered. Because real reform begins in discomfort. That Friday, Admiral Thompson attended dismissal again. No cameras this time. No spectacle. Just father and daughter. As Amara approached the car, he opened the door for her. "You handled yourself with integrity," he said softly. She smiled faintly. "You taught me that." He nodded once. "Remember, titles come and go, character remains." She looked back at the school building one last time. It didn't look smaller. It didn't look defeated. It looked changed. And change, when honest, is powerful. The immediate consequences had been swift. Administrative leave. Public acknowledgement. Policy reform. But deeper than all of that, a message had been sent. To every student watching. To every teacher listening. Dignity does not require validation from authority. Authority requires validation from dignity. And Crestview Academy had just learned that lesson the hard way. The headlines didn't fade after a week. They evolved. What began as a quiet school controversy turned into a broader conversation about credibility, bias, and the architecture of elite institutions. Crestview Academy had long been known for polished excellence. Now it was being examined under a different lens. And under scrutiny, institutions either shrink or transform. Within 2 weeks, Crestview's Board of Trustees commissioned a full, independent investigation. Not symbolic, not internal. External auditors specializing in educational equity and institutional accountability were brought in. Their mandate was clear. Review faculty conduct records. Analyze student surveys anonymously. Examine disciplinary disparities. Assess cultural climate. Classrooms were observed. Interviews conducted. Data gathered. The findings weren't explosive. They were consistent. Patterns of subtle bias. Students from affluent legacy families were given the benefit of the doubt more often. Scholarship students were more frequently asked to clarify their statements. Parents with recognizable last names received faster administrative responses. No one policy was discriminatory, but the ecosystem favored familiarity. And familiarity often favors privilege. On a gray Thursday evening, the Crestview Auditorium transformed into something more solemn. Rows of parents filled the seats. Faculty members sat stiffly together. A live-stream camera blinked red in the back. The Board of Trustees took the stage. This wasn't a trial. It was accountability. The board chair spoke first. "This is not about one teacher. It is about institutional blind spots." Mrs. Hawthorne sat off to the side, not in the spotlight but present. Her administrative leave had concluded. The investigation determined she had violated professional standards by publicly dismissing a student without verification and by creating a hostile classroom environment. The board announced a formal written reprimand placed permanently in her file, a suspension without pay for the remainder of the semester, mandatory completion of advanced bias and cultural competency training, probationary status upon return. Some parents wanted termination. Others wanted restoration. The board chose reform. Because accountability without opportunity for change breeds fear, not growth. Though he declined media interviews, Admiral David Thompson submitted a written statement to be read at the hearing. His words were calm, measured, unapologetically direct. Leadership is not measured by rank but by responsibility. Schools shape how children see themselves. When credibility is withheld based on perception, the damage extends beyond one moment. My daughter does not need special treatment. She deserves equal treatment. That is the standard. The auditorium remained silent long after the statement ended. Because he hadn't demanded punishment. He had demanded equity. And that was harder to ignore. Within a month, Crestview Academy implemented sweeping reforms. Teachers could no longer publicly challenge factual claims without private verification. If doubt arose, protocol required discretion and confirmation before confrontation. All faculty underwent quarterly workshops led by independent facilitators. These sessions included real case studies, anonymous student testimonials, implicit bias assessments, role-playing restorative scenarios. Some teachers were uncomfortable, some defensive, but discomfort is the birthplace of awareness. A new student-led council was created to report concerns directly to the board. Amara was invited to join. She declined the spotlight role, but agreed to participate quietly. Because her goal had never been attention. It had been fairness. An anonymous digital reporting system was introduced for students and parents. Complaints could no longer be buried. Patterns could no longer hide. The changes were not immediate miracles, but they were visible. In classrooms, teachers paused before dismissing answers. They asked follow-up questions instead of assumptions. They listened. Parents noticed the shift in tone during conferences. Students began speaking more confidently about their experiences. The air at Crestview felt different, less rigid, more reflective. During her suspension, Mrs. Hawthorne attended intensive training sessions. At first, she resisted internally. She had never considered herself biased. She had championed academic fairness for decades. But training forced her to confront data, forced her to sit with stories from former students who had felt minimized, stories that mirrored Amara's moment. The hardest lesson wasn't learning new policies. It was grieving the version of herself she thought she was. When she returned months later, she did not return unchanged. Her first day back, she stood before her class, no pearls, hair pulled back simply. "I made a mistake," she said openly, "and I am committed to doing better." The admission surprised students. Authority rarely confesses. But growth had replaced pride. Through it all, Amara remained steady. She continued excelling academically, continued raising her hand thoughtfully, continued walking the halls without arrogance. Her classmates' perception shifted gradually, not because of her father's rank, but because of her consistency. She never weaponized the revelation, never referenced it, never sought advantage. And that quiet restraint earned more respect than power ever could. Educational publications began referencing the Crestview model of reform. A case study was published about the incident and the systemic changes that followed. Other private academies requested consultation. District schools reached out for partnership. The story had outgrown its origin. It wasn't about a naval chief anymore. It was about how quickly we judge credibility, and how deeply systems must examine themselves. One afternoon, months later, Career Day returned. The same banner hung above the board. Future leaders start here. Students shared their parents' professions once more. A girl stood. "My mom is a sanitation worker." A few heads turned. Mrs. Hawthorne smiled warmly. "Tell us more," she encouraged. No skepticism. No tightening of tone. Just curiosity. The room listened. That was reform. Not loud. Not dramatic. But real. Crestview Academy had not been destroyed. It had been rebuilt, layer by layer, assumption by assumption, because sometimes institutions need a mirror held up to them by the smallest voice in the room. And sometimes that voice belongs to a 12-year-old girl who simply told the truth. The harbor looked the same. Ships still drifted in and out like silent giants. The tide still rose and fell against the docks. Crestview Academy still stood tall on its manicured hill, ivy curling neatly along its stone walls. But inside those walls, something fundamental had shifted. And change, when rooted in truth, does not stay contained. It ripples. 3 months after the incident, Crestview's reform policies began circulating among other institutions. Private schools in neighboring counties requested copies of the new equity verification policy. Public school administrators invited Crestview's board chair to speak at district leadership forums. An educational journal published a case study titled "Credibility and Culture: Lessons from Crestview Academy." It wasn't framed as scandal. It was framed as transformation. And at the center of that transformation, though never seeking it, was Amara Thompson. At school, Amara's life returned to rhythm. Morning drop-offs, algebra quizzes, choir practice, library afternoons. But subtle differences followed her. Younger students looked at her with admiration, not because of her father's rank, but because she had remained steady under pressure. One afternoon, a 4th grader approached her near the courtyard fountain. "They didn't believe me once either," the younger girl said quietly, "about my mom being a scientist." Amara paused. The wind lifted strands of her hair gently. "What did you do?" she asked. "I stopped talking about it." Amara's chest tightened slightly. That was the real cost of disbelief. Silencing. "You don't have to stop," Amara said softly. "You just have to know who you are." The younger girl nodded, eyes brightening. That moment didn't make headlines, but it mattered more than any article ever could. Meanwhile, Mrs. Hawthorne's return to teaching was quieter than her suspension. She no longer walked the halls with rigid certainty. She listened longer, asked more questions, invited perspectives she might once have overlooked. In one class discussion about leadership, she posed a new prompt. "What does power look like?" Students offered answers: confidence, wealth, influence. She nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes," she added, "power looks like patience. Sometimes it looks like telling the truth when no one believes you." Her eyes met Amara for a brief moment. Not with guilt, not with defensiveness, but with acknowledgement. The room felt different now. Safer. At home, Admiral David Thompson stood on the balcony overlooking the water one evening, uniform jacket draped over a chair. The sun dipped low, painting the horizon in amber and deep blue. Amara joined him. They watched a naval vessel glide slowly toward open sea. "You didn't have to come to the school," she said after a moment. He smiled faintly. "Yes, I did." "Because of your job." "No," he replied, "because of my responsibility." He looked down at her. "There will be moments in your life when people underestimate you, not because you're wrong, but because their imagination is limited. Your job is not to shrink to fit their imagination." She absorbed the words. The harbor wind carried salt and possibility. Months passed. The Crestview story resurfaced when a national education conference invited Dr. Langford to speak about institutional reform. He stood before hundreds of educators and shared the lesson plainly. Bias rarely announces itself. It whispers through assumptions. Slides displayed Crestview's new data, improved student satisfaction scores, reduced disciplinary disparities, increased faculty self-reporting of bias awareness. The reforms were measurable, tangible, replicable. And in panel discussions, educators began sharing their own stories of misjudgment and growth. The conversation had expanded beyond one academy. It had become about systems. As the year progressed, Amara grew, not taller necessarily, but stronger in presence. She joined the debate team, not to dominate, but to articulate. Her voice carried calm conviction. In a regional competition, she delivered a speech on leadership and accountability. She didn't mention her father. She didn't mention Crestview. She simply said, "True leadership listens before it judges." The judges awarded her first place. But more importantly, her peers applauded without hesitation. Not because of who she was connected to, but because of who she was. One evening near the end of the school year, Crestview hosted its annual awards ceremony. The auditorium buzzed with families dressed in formal attire. This time, when Admiral Thompson entered, there were no whispers of disbelief, only nods of recognition. He sat in the back row, as always. No spectacle. Amara received an Academic Excellence Award. When her name was called, she walked to the stage calmly, accepted the plaque, thanked her teachers, returned to her seat. The applause lingered. But what lingered longer was something unseen. A recalibrated culture. A school that now paused before doubting. Students who now spoke without fear of dismissal. Teachers who now reflected before reacting. Across town, another private academy began implementing similar reforms after a parent cited the Crestview case study. A public middle school introduced its own student voice council. A district superintendent referenced Admiral Thompson's statement in a leadership newsletter. The ripple continued. Because when dignity stands firm, it exposes fragility in systems and invites them to strengthen. One afternoon, months after everything settled, Mrs. Hawthorne approached Amara after class. "May I walk with you?" she asked gently. They stepped into the hallway together. "I want you to know," Mrs. Hawthorne said carefully, "that your steadiness changed me." Amara considered that. "I didn't try to," she replied. "I know," the teacher said, "that's why it mattered." Growth rarely announces itself loudly. It happens in softened tones, in humbled steps, in changed patterns. Summer approached. Crestview's hill turned vibrant green again. The harbor sparkled under long golden evenings. Amara stood at her bedroom window one night, looking toward the distant ships. She imagined the future. Not just hers, but others. Girls who would stand in classrooms and speak confidently about their parents, their dreams, their truths. Without laughter, without doubt, without dismissal. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt hopeful. And hope is more powerful than vindication. The year that began with humiliation ended with transformation. Not because power crushed opposition, but because truth endured pressure. And somewhere beyond the harbor, ships continued their steady course, reminders that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it stands quietly and waits. The harbor was quiet the morning the story finally stopped making headlines. No reporters at the gate. No flashing cameras. No breaking news alerts. Just gulls circling lazily above the water and the distant horn of a ship signaling departure. Crestview Academy stood exactly as it always had, stone walls steady, ivy clinging, banners polished. From the outside, nothing about the building suggested that anything extraordinary had happened within its classrooms. But buildings do not carry culture. People do. And something inside those walls had shifted permanently. There is a particular kind of injustice that does not shout. It doesn't slam doors. It doesn't use slurs. It wears professionalism like perfume. It smiles while it questions. It corrects while it diminishes. It says, "Let be honest." And in that moment, it quietly decides whose truth sounds believable. That is the injustice Amara faced. Not violence, not cruelty in its loudest form, but dismissal. And dismissal can be just as damaging because it chips away at identity. It suggests that credibility must be earned differently by different people. It whispers that some voices require proof, while others are trusted instinctively. The most powerful part of this story was never the Admiral's uniform. It was never the black SUVs. It was never the stunned silence in the hallway. It was the moment a 12-year-old girl chose not to shrink. She did not argue loudly. She did not plead. She did not crumble under laughter. She simply repeated the truth. And then she sat down. That kind of restraint is not weakness. It is discipline. It is dignity under pressure. It is knowing who you are, even when someone with authority suggests you are mistaken. Some of you watching have lived this moment. Maybe not in a classroom. Maybe in a boardroom, a hospital, a courtroom, a restaurant, a workplace where your credentials were questioned twice, while others were believed once. Maybe someone said, "Are you sure?" in a tone that implied doubt. Maybe someone smiled while dismissing you. Maybe you walked away wondering whether to correct them or conserve your energy. And maybe, like Amara, you chose composure because you understood something powerful. Your truth does not depend on their imagination. Mrs. Hawthorne learned something too. Her mistake was not cartoon villainy. It was common, which is precisely why it was dangerous. She believed she was fair. She believed she valued honesty. And yet, when presented with a truth that did not match her internal template of power, she rejected it. That is how bias works. Not always through hatred, but through limitation, through mental shortcuts shaped by environment and repetition, through assumptions that go unchecked because they feel reasonable. Her transformation mattered, not because she was punished, but because she confronted herself. She sat in discomfort. She listened. She changed. And that is what reform actually requires. Not public shamming, not performative apologies, but internal reconstruction. Crestview Academy could have minimized the incident. They could have issued a quiet apology and moved on. They could have protected reputation over reflection. Instead, they chose transparency, policy change, structural accountability. They acknowledged that a single moment revealed a larger pattern. And when institutions admit patterns, they open the door to progress. That is rare. And it is necessary. Because injustice thrives in silence, but weakens in light. If you strip away the rank, the medals, the headlines, this story becomes something simpler. A child said, "This is who my father is." An adult responded, "That cannot be true." And the child did not fold. That's it. That's the heartbeat of it. And it matters because so many children, especially children who do not fit traditional molds of power, learn early that their words may be doubted. They learn to soften their claims, to downplay their stories, to edit themselves so they are easier to believe. But imagine a world where they didn't have to. Imagine classrooms where credibility was not filtered through bias. Imagine institutions where curiosity replaced skepticism. Imagine teachers who responded with, "Tell me more," instead of, "That's not possible." That world begins with moments like this. There's a reason Admiral Thompson never raised his voice. Authority does not need volume. He did not demand spectacle. He demanded standard. My daughter does not need special treatment, he said. She deserves equal treatment. That sentence carries weight far beyond a single academy. Equal treatment. Not extra. Not preferential. Just equal. And equality is not achieved through assumption. It is achieved through attention, through awareness, through humility. As the months turned into a new school year, Crestview students carried something with them that no textbook could teach. They had witnessed accountability. They had seen power confronted by truth. They had watched a teacher admit fault. They had observed an institution evolve. Those lessons will outlast algebra formulas and vocabulary lists. Because children remember how adults handle mistakes. They remember who listens. They remember who grows. And those memories shape how they will lead someday. Amara will not always be 12. She will grow taller. Her ambitions will expand. Her life will stretch beyond the harbor and the academy hill. But the core of who she became in that moment, the steadiness, the refusal to shrink, will travel with her. And somewhere in the future, when she stands in a room where someone questions her credibility, she will remember that day. She will remember that truth does not panic. It waits, and she will stand just as steady. For every Amara watching this story, hear this clearly. You are not responsible for making others comfortable with your truth. You are responsible for honoring it. If someone doubts you because of how you look, where you come from, or what you drive, that doubt belongs to them, not you. Carry yourself with the same composure. Speak clearly. Stand firm. And let integrity do the heavy lifting. For every educator watching, this story is not an accusation. It is an invitation. An invitation to pause before correcting, to verify before dismissing, to reflect before assuming, to ask, why did I react that way? Because leadership in a classroom shapes leadership in a nation. And sometimes the most powerful lesson you can teach is the one you learn publicly. And for every institution, remember, reputation is not protected by denial. It is protected by growth, by admitting blind spots, by building systems that prevent repetition, by ensuring that no student feels smaller for telling the truth. We will continue telling stories like this. Stories where dignity stands against dismissal. Stories where justice is not loud, but lasting. Stories where the smallest voice in the room becomes the clearest. Because these narratives do more than entertain. They recalibrate us. They remind us. They challenge us to examine how we respond the next time someone says something we didn't expect. Will we laugh? Will we doubt? Or will we listen? If this story stirred something in you, anger, hope, recognition, don't let it fade when the screen goes dark. Carry it into your conversations, into your classrooms, into your workplaces. Stand up when someone is dismissed unfairly. Ask questions when assumptions surface. And most importantly, believe people when they tell you who they are. Because dignity should never have to prove itself. It should simply be respected. And that respect begins with us.